What if I told you that one of Hollywood's most legendary actors had been hiding something beneath his property for decades? And what if the FBI finally uncovered it, descending 300 feet underground to find something that would make international headlines? This isn't fiction. This is about Gene Hackman, the five-time Academy Award nominee who vanished from Hollywood 20 years ago. And what authorities discovered in his secret tunnel is absolutely mind-blowing. Before we dive deep into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what happens next. Gene Hackman isn't just any actor. We're talking about the man who gave us unforgettable performances in The French Connection, Unforgiven, and The Conversation. He's won 2 Oscars. He's been nominated for 3 more, and is widely considered one of the greatest actors of all time. But in 2004, at the height of his career, Hackman did something almost unheard of in Hollywood. He walked away completely. No farewell tour, no final press conference, just silence. He retreated to his ranch in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and essentially disappeared from public life. For years, people assumed he was simply enjoying a quiet retirement, maybe writing novels, spending time with family. But the truth was far more complex and fascinating than anyone could have imagined. The first hints that something unusual was happening came from local contractors in Santa Fe. Around 2007, as several construction companies reported being hired by Hackman for what they described as highly secretive projects on his sprawling property. These weren't your typical home renovations. Workers were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements, something almost unheard of for residential construction. The few details that did leak out painted a strange picture. There were mentions of reinforced concrete structures, industrial ventilation systems, and massive excavation equipment being brought onto the property under cover of darkness. One contractor, speaking anonymously years later, described being hired to install what appeared to be an elevator shaft that descended far deeper than any residential building would ever require. Neighbors began noticing odd activities too. Trucks arriving at strange hours, always at night. The sound of heavy machinery echoing across the desert landscape. Security around Hackman's property increased dramatically, with high fences, surveillance cameras, and even security personnel patrolling the perimeter. When local reporters tried to investigate, they hit walls of silence. Hackman's representatives refused all comments, and anyone who had worked on the property was bound by those ironclad NDAs. The mystery deepened when utility companies reported unusual power consumption patterns from the property. The amount of electricity being used was consistent with a small industrial facility, not a private residence. Water usage also spiked dramatically, suggesting something far more extensive than typical household needs. The FBI's interest began in 2015, though the details of what triggered their investigation remain partially classified. According to sources within the Bureau, it started with a routine geological survey of the area. Scientists studying underground water tables in New Mexico noticed unusual seismic readings near Hackman's property. These weren't natural formations or typical construction signatures. The readings suggested a sophisticated underground structure, extensive tunneling, and possible connections to natural cave systems in the region. When this information was cross-referenced with satellite imagery showing the property's evolution over the years, federal investigators became concerned. The timing coincided with increased scrutiny of private underground bunkers following several high-profile cases involving illegal weapons storage and potential domestic security threats. Initially, the FBI approached the situation diplomatically. They requested a meeting with Hackman, hoping for a voluntary explanation and tour of his property. Hackman, through his attorneys, declined. He cited privacy concerns and insisted that everything on his property was entirely legal and properly permitted. This wasn't entirely false. Records showed that Hackman had indeed obtained various construction permits over the years, though the permits described relatively mundane projects like wine cellars and storage facilities. Nothing in the public record indicated the scale of what was actually being built underground. While the FBI's concern intensified when intelligence analysts noticed encrypted communications originating from Hackman's property. These weren't ordinary internet traffic. They were sophisticated, military-grade encrypted signals that suggested either extremely sensitive communications or potentially classified information being transmitted. The legal battle that followed lasted nearly 3 years. Hackman's legal team argued passionately for his right to privacy, citing the Fourth Amendment and the absence of any evidence of criminal activity. Federal prosecutors countered that the scale and nature of the underground construction, combined with the encrypted communications and refusal to allow inspection, constituted reasonable grounds for investigation under national security statutes. The case wound its way through federal courts, with each side winning and losing various motions. Finally, in late 2018, a federal judge issued a warrant, allowing the FBI to conduct a comprehensive search of Hackman's property, specifically including any underground structures. The warrant was carefully crafted to balance security concerns with Hackman's constitutional rights, but it was unambiguous. The FBI would gain access to whatever lay beneath his New Mexico ranch. The operation began on a cold January morning in 2019. Over 50 federal agents descended on the property, accompanied by structural engineers, geologists, and even representatives from the Department of Energy. Hackman, now in his late 80s, was present but said nothing as agents presented the warrant. What they found on the surface was impressive enough. A beautiful ranch house, meticulously maintained grounds, and what appeared to be several large barn structures. But it was what lay beneath that would shock everyone involved. Behind a false wall in one of the barns, agents discovered a massive steel door, the kind you'd find at a bank vault or military installation. This door was the entrance to the tunnel system, and it was just the beginning of an underground complex that defied all expectations. Descending into the tunnel was like entering another world. The construction quality was extraordinary, rivaling anything built by government agencies or major corporations. The main shaft dropped vertically for approximately 50 feet before opening into a horizontal tunnel system. Everything was reinforced concrete and steel, with state-of-the-art ventilation systems providing fresh air throughout. LED lighting illuminated the passages, which were wide enough to drive a small vehicle through. The tunnel stretched horizontally for hundreds of feet, with multiple branches and chambers along the way. Structural engineers on site were amazed at the sophistication of the construction. This wasn't the work of amateurs or a simple DIY project. This required serious engineering expertise, millions of dollars in investment, and years of careful planning and execution. At approximately 100 feet down the main passage, the FBI team encountered the first major chamber. This room, roughly the size of a basketball court, was filled with something nobody expected: books. Thousands upon thousands of books, arranged in climate-controlled shelving units that stretched from floor to ceiling. But these weren't ordinary books. As agents began examining them, they realized they were looking at one of the most significant private collections of rare manuscripts and first editions ever assembled. There were original Shakespeare folios, rare illuminated medieval manuscripts, first editions of works by Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and other literary giants. Some volumes were so rare that they were thought to exist in only one or two copies worldwide. The estimated value of this single room's contents exceeded $100 million, but the collection was entirely legal. Hackman had apparently been a passionate and secretive bibliophile for decades, acquiring these treasures through legitimate dealers and auction houses. Continuing deeper into the complex, the team reached the 200-foot mark, where they discovered something even more unexpected: a fully functional film preservation laboratory. This facility would have been impressive at any major studio or archive. It contained professional-grade equipment for restoring and preserving old films, including temperature and humidity-controlled vaults storing thousands of film reels. Hackman had apparently taken it upon himself to preserve classic films, particularly those at risk of being lost forever due to deterioration or neglect. The collection included rare prints of films from Hollywood's golden age, many with alternate scenes or endings that had never been publicly released. There were also extensive collections of films from around the world, including works from Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America that were virtually impossible to find anywhere else. Film historians later described this discovery as one of the most important finds for cinema preservation in decades. But it was at the 300-foot level that investigators found what would truly change everything. Here, the tunnel opened into a massive natural cavern that Hackman's construction had connected to and modified. This cavern, likely millions of years old, had been transformed into something breathtaking: a fully functional underground ecosystem. Hackman had created an enormous hydroponic garden, using advanced agricultural technology to grow plants in this subterranean environment. But he wasn't growing ordinary vegetables or flowers. This was a seed vault, similar in concept to the famous Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway. Jan Hackman had been collecting and preserving seeds from thousands of plant species, including many that were endangered or extinct in the wild. The climate control systems maintained perfect conditions for long-term seed storage, and the isolation provided protection from surface disasters, climate change, or other catastrophes. The scope of Hackman's seed preservation project was staggering. Genetic analysis later revealed that he had seeds from plant species thought to be extinct, varieties of crops that had disappeared from commercial agriculture, and rare wild plants from ecosystems around the world. He had apparently spent millions funding botanical expeditions, working with scientists and conservationists globally to acquire and preserve this genetic diversity. What made this discovery even more remarkable was that Hackman had done all of this privately, without seeking recognition or publicity. He had built what was essentially a backup plan for the planet's botanical heritage, motivated purely by a belief that future generations might desperately need this resource. Environmental scientists and botanists who later studied the collection called it visionary, comparing Hackman's foresight to the great conservationists of history. Adjacent to the seed vault, investigators discovered extensive research facilities where Hackman had apparently been working with hired scientists to study plant genetics and develop more resilient crop varieties. There were laboratories equipped with DNA sequencing technology, growth chambers where experimental plants were being cultivated, and extensive computer systems analyzing genetic data. Documents found on site revealed that Hackman had been particularly focused on developing drought-resistant varieties of essential food crops, anticipating future climate challenges. He had been funding this research entirely from his own fortune, accumulated from decades of successful acting and wise investments. The scientists working with him, all bound by confidentiality agreements, described him as deeply committed to the project, spending hours daily learning about genetics, agriculture, and conservation biology. The FBI's investigation took an unexpected turn as they realized that Hackman hadn't broken any laws. Everything in the underground complex was legal. The construction had been done on his private property, the rare books and films had been legally acquired, and the seed vault, while unusual, violated no regulations. The encrypted communications that had initially raised concerns were simply Hackman protecting his scientific data and coordinating with researchers around the world. Far from being a threat, Hackman had been quietly working on projects that could benefit humanity. The FBI agents, initially expecting to uncover something nefarious, instead found themselves documenting one of the most remarkable private conservation and preservation efforts ever undertaken. The investigation concluded with no charges filed, but the secret was now out, and the world wanted to know more about what Gene Hackman had really been doing for the past 15 years. Hackman eventually agreed to a single interview about the project, his first major public appearance since retiring from acting. His explanation was both simple and profound. After decades in Hollywood, surrounded by superficiality and pretense, he had wanted to do something meaningful with his remaining years and resources. He had become increasingly concerned about humanity's direction, particularly regarding environmental conservation and cultural preservation. The underground complex represented his answer to a question that haunted him. What could one person do to make a real difference? Rather than start a public foundation or charity, which he felt often wasted resources on overhead and publicity, he decided to directly fund and create preservation projects himself. The secrecy wasn't about hiding anything illegal, it was about avoiding the media circus and maintaining focus on the work itself. And the film preservation facility had started as a personal project. Hackman loved classic cinema and was horrified to learn how many films from early Hollywood had been lost forever due to neglect and deterioration. He began acquiring rare prints and funding their restoration, working with expert archivists and technicians. The project grew as he realized the scope of the problem. With films from around the world at risk of being lost, the rare book collection began similarly, from his love of literature and growing awareness of how many significant texts existed in only a handful of copies, vulnerable to fire, flood, or simple deterioration. By preserving these works in his climate-controlled underground facility, he was ensuring that future generations would have access to these cultural treasures. Regardless of what happened on the surface, the seed vault represented Hackman's deepest concern, the future of the planet's food supply and biodiversity. He had read extensively about species extinction, the loss of agricultural diversity, and the vulnerabilities in modern food systems. The more he learned, the more urgent the problem seemed. Hackman reached out to botanists and agricultural scientists, offering to fund preservation efforts with no strings attached. The underground cavern on his property provided the perfect location for a private seed vault, protected from surface threats and maintained at ideal conditions. Over more than a decade, he built relationships with seed banks, botanical gardens, and conservation organizations worldwide, quietly supporting their work and adding to his own collection. His goal wasn't to replace institutional efforts, but to provide redundancy, knowing that institutional facilities could fail due to funding cuts, political instability, or natural disasters. The scientific research component had evolved naturally from the seed preservation work. Hackman recognized that simply storing seeds wasn't enough. Humanity also needed better, more resilient crops to face future challenges. He began funding research into genetic improvement of staple crops, focusing on traits like drought resistance, pest resistance, and nutritional enhancement. This work was conducted ethically and legally, with all results intended to be shared freely with agricultural researchers and farmers worldwide. Hackman saw himself not as a scientist, but as an enabler, and providing resources and freedom for qualified researchers to pursue important work without the usual constraints of grant applications and institutional politics. Several of the crop varieties developed in his underground laboratories have since shown remarkable promise in field trials, potentially offering real solutions to agricultural challenges facing developing nations. Public reaction to these revelations was overwhelmingly positive. Instead of the scandal many had expected, Hackman became celebrated as a visionary philanthropist who had put his money and effort toward genuinely important causes. Environmental organizations praised his seed preservation work, film historians celebrated his contribution to cinema preservation, and literary scholars were thrilled by his rare book collection. The story of his secret underground complex became an inspiration, demonstrating that private citizens with resources and commitment could make significant contributions to solving global problems. Universities reached out, offering to partner with Hackman on research and preservation efforts. The Smithsonian Institution expressed interest in eventually housing parts of his collections, ensuring they would be accessible to scholars and the public. Even the FBI agents who had investigated him expressed admiration for what he had accomplished. Hackman announced that he would be transitioning his private projects into a proper foundation, ensuring their continuation beyond his lifetime. The underground complex would remain operational, with professional staff managing the preservation and research work. And he committed additional funding to expand the programs, particularly the seed vault and agricultural research components. Partnerships were established with major universities and research institutions, allowing the work to scale up, while maintaining the focused, efficient approach that had characterized his private efforts. The rare book and film collections would eventually be donated to appropriate institutions, though Hackman insisted on maintaining control during his lifetime to ensure proper care and protection. His vision was that these projects, started in secrecy and solitude, would ultimately benefit humanity long into the future. The story of Gene Hackman's secret tunnel and underground complex reveals something profound about the man behind the legendary acting career. While audiences knew him for intense and complex characters on screen, few realized that Hackman himself possessed the same depth, intelligence, and commitment to important causes. His decision to step away from Hollywood at the peak of his career now makes perfect sense. He had found something more meaningful than fame or fortune, the opportunity to make a lasting difference in preserving human culture and protecting the planet's biological diversity. The tunnel, descending 300 feet beneath the New Mexico desert, wasn't a bunker built from paranoia or a vault for hoarding wealth. It was a temple to knowledge, preservation, and hope for the future, built by a man who understood that true legacy isn't measured in box office receipts or awards, but in contributions that outlast us. What's particularly striking about Hackman's journey is how it challenges our understanding of success and fulfillment in modern society. We're constantly fed the narrative that staying in the spotlight, accumulating accolades, and maintaining relevance in the public eye is the ultimate measure of achievement. Yet here was one of the greatest actors of our time, choosing deliberately to walk away from all of that. He rejected the endless cycle of premieres, award shows, and paparazzi attention because he had discovered something far more compelling: the ability to quietly shape the future without needing validation from the entertainment industry or the general public. His story shows that true power lies not in being seen, but in doing work that genuinely matters, whether anyone notices or not. The impact of this discovery extended far beyond Hackman himself. In the years following the FBI investigation, seed banks and botanical institutions worldwide reported increased funding and support from wealthy individuals inspired by his example. Universities began establishing new programs in agricultural genetics and plant conservation. The rare book and film preservation movements gained momentum as collectors and institutions recognized the importance of preserving cultural artifacts before they were lost forever. Hackman had inadvertently created a template for how private wealth could be deployed to address global challenges, not through flashy public foundations that generate headlines, but through sustained, focused efforts built on genuine expertise and deep commitment. He proved that one person, who working persistently and intelligently, really could make a measurable difference in the world. The underground complex itself became something of a pilgrimage site for scientists, conservationists, and scholars who were invited to tour the facilities and study the work being conducted there. Environmental activists particularly championed Hackman's seed preservation efforts as a crucial safeguard against the biodiversity collapse that many scientists warn is coming. The redundancy he had built into the system, with multiple backup storage facilities and comprehensive genetic documentation, meant that even if something catastrophic happened, this knowledge and genetic material would survive. In conversations with visitors, Hackman demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of ecological principles, climate science, and the interconnected systems that sustain life on Earth. His self-directed education over the past 2 decades had been remarkably thorough, suggesting that beneath the film preservation work and book collecting lay a deeply philosophical thinker contemplating humanity's future. Interestingly, some of the most important work happening in that underground complex was the collaboration with researchers in developing nations. Hackman had intentionally focused resources on crop improvements that would benefit farmers in Africa, Asia, and South America, regions most vulnerable to climate change and food insecurity. Through carefully constructed partnerships with agricultural universities in countries like Kenya, India, and Peru, the research being conducted was specifically tailored to address local challenges. The drought-resistant varieties of sorghum, millet, and other traditional crops were being developed and tested in actual farming conditions. This wasn't theoretical research conducted for academic prestige. It was practical, applied science aimed at the concrete problem of feeding growing populations in regions facing increasing climate stress. The fact that Hackman had chosen to remain anonymous for so long meant that this work had proceeded without the complications that often arise when Western wealth and influence become too visible in developing world projects. Perhaps most fascinating was what investigators discovered about Hackman's intellectual evolution over the years. They found extensive personal libraries in his ranch home, filled with books on subjects ranging from climate science to genetics to agricultural history. His margin notes and highlighted passages revealed a man engaged in deep, serious study, wrestling with complex ideas and trying to understand the interconnected challenges facing humanity. He had attended seminars at universities, corresponded with leading scientists, and spent countless hours absorbing knowledge across multiple disciplines. The Gene Hackman, who emerged from this investigation, wasn't simply a wealthy actor spending his retirement on hobbies. He was a dedicated scholar who had essentially spent 15 years conducting a self-directed graduate education in order to contribute meaningfully to solving real problems. His intelligence and work ethic, qualities that had made him such a compelling actor, had been redirected toward pursuits he deemed more important than entertainment. The security and secrecy that had initially seemed suspicious now appeared in a different light. By keeping his projects private, Hackman had avoided the constant attention and scrutiny that would inevitably follow if a Hollywood legend announced he was building a massive seed vault and funding genetic research. He had protected the work from media sensationalism, from competitors or bad actors who might want to interfere, and from the distraction of managing public perception. The non-disclosure agreements weren't about hiding crimes. They were about creating a space where serious scientific work could proceed without the complications of fame and public interest. It was, in many ways, the action of someone who had already experienced the downsides of celebrity and understood that meaningful work required privacy and focus. The encrypted communications made sense too. He was protecting sensitive research data and maintaining professional confidentiality with collaborators around the world. As we reflect on this remarkable story, it's worth considering what it reveals about our contemporary moment. We live in an era of unprecedented transparency, where every action and thought seems to demand documentation and sharing on social media. The pressure to publicize charitable work, to seek recognition and validation for our contributions, is enormous. Yet Hackman's example suggests that some of the most important work might be happening quietly, without fanfare or recognition. There are likely other individuals with resources and commitment undertaking significant projects that we'll never hear about, precisely because they're not seeking attention. And the secrecy that surrounded Hackman's tunnel wasn't evidence of wrongdoing. It was a conscious choice to protect the integrity of important work from the corrosive effects of celebrity and public relations considerations. The story also raises interesting questions about what we choose to celebrate and remember about public figures. For decades, Hackman's legacy was defined by his film roles, his Oscar nominations, and his acting achievements. That's certainly significant, and his contributions to cinema are genuinely important. But now his legacy encompasses something broader and perhaps ultimately more meaningful, a demonstration that someone could step away from the pinnacle of professional success to pursue deeper, more consequential work. His underground complex is unlikely to ever be as famous as the films he starred in, but its impact on food security, botanical preservation, and cultural conservation might ultimately matter more to humanity's future. It's a humbling thought that perhaps the greatest achievements of influential people often happen in obscurity, unrecognized by the public but profoundly important to the world. Looking forward, the question now becomes what Hackman's discovery might inspire in others. Will wealthy individuals and institutions increasingly recognize their responsibility to contribute to preservation and conservation efforts? Will there be a shift toward longer-term thinking about humanity's challenges, with more resources devoted to ensuring our collective survival and well-being rather than short-term profitability? The answers remain uncertain, but Hackman's example has certainly sparked conversations about what's possible when intelligence, resources, and genuine commitment to making a difference align. He demonstrated that you don't need to be a scientist, politician, or government official to address global challenges. You just need vision, determination, and a willingness to work persistently toward meaningful goals. That's an inspiring message for all of us, regardless of our own resources or circumstances. If Hackman could accomplish so much working alone in the desert, imagine what could be achieved if more people directed their energy towards solving real problems instead of pursuing fame or accumulation of wealth. Thanks so much for watching this incredible story. If you found it fascinating, and please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories that will absolutely blow your mind. We upload new content regularly, so make sure to turn on your notifications so you never miss a video. Share this with friends who love mysteries and true crime. We'll see you in the next one.